What's up everybody, I'm HoopsandHipHop. So if you've been following the channel for the past little while, you'll know that I'm really into Pokemon facts and trivia. Well, for today's video, as the title would suggest, I'm going to cover 10 Pokemon facts that you don't know. I mean, I know you guys are pretty smart, so you might actually know some of these, but these facts are all ones that are seldom mentioned at all. So without further ado, let's get right into it. Alright, this first one is just a hypothetical, but it's still really cool. As we all know, Pokemon are only capable of being two types at once. Depending on the combination, having two types can be a huge competitive advantage, so it would stand to reason that if a Pokemon were capable of having all 18 types, it would be basically unstoppable. However, a Pokemon with all 18 types would actually still be weak to rock-type attacks. I guess Brock knew what he was doing after all. Moving on, the Japanese version of Pokemon Crystal was actually capable of connecting to the internet, although in a very primitive format. Using the mobile Game Boy adapter, players could connect their Game Boys with a copy of Pokemon Crystal to a Japanese mobile phone in order to access the Pokemon Mobile System GB, which was essentially an online lobby that would allow players to interact with one another and even allowed for online battles. In case you weren't aware, there's a small island country about 1,500 miles north of New Zealand known as Niue. Now the reason why this is notable is because the country actually printed a series of Pokemon coins that were actually counted as legal tender in the country. There's a variety of Pokemon featured, including the Kanto starters, Pikachu, and Meowth, and they're valued at $1 a piece, although their collector value is definitely much higher. Nintendo is notorious for being very protective with their IPs. They rarely let anyone else work with them, and they almost never appear on non-Nintendo consoles. The reason why I say almost is because there actually were a series of Pokemon games developed for a Sega console. I actually discussed this in my 10 Pokemon games you might not know about video, but there were actually 3 Pokemon games developed for the edutainment console known as the Sega Pico, and Sega even released a special edition Pikachu version of the console. The games themselves are very simple and obscure, and I recommend checking out my previous video on them if you'd like to know more. By the time Pokemon first released in Japan in February of 1996, the release of Nintendo's next home console, the N64, was only about 4 months away, and we saw the release of the first Pokemon home console games shortly thereafter. However, despite being effectively discontinued, there actually was a Pokemon game released on the Super Nintendo. Picross NP was a game released exclusively in Japan and exclusively via Nintendo Power. The game was distributed via download onto blank cartridges, where customers would buy the cartridges and then have the games downloaded onto them as opposed to buying them in the standard cartridge format. Picross MP was a standard Picross game that released in 8 volumes, with the first volume being themed around Pokemon. Next up is one that's hiding in plain sight, and you don't really hear it mentioned at all, but it's really interesting. So if you take a look at Parasect of all things and inspect its Pokédex entries, you'll find a rather interesting one from Fire Red version. In the entry, it specifically mentions China as a place where Parasect's toxic spores are used in medicine. Now, while there have been a couple times in the anime where the real world has been mentioned, it almost never happens in the games, where one of, if not the only other time being, when Mew has said to have been from South America. This one definitely revives the discussion on how the Pokemon world relates to our own. At the very beginning of Pokemon Red and Blue, we see Professor Oak welcome us to the world of Pokemon, and he is joined by one of the first Pokemon we were ever introduced to in Nidorino. However, even though we see Nidorino, it actually has the cry of a Nidorina in the intro. Take a listen. So it's no secret that many Pokemon take inspiration from animals, and many of them are named in part after the animal they're based on. However, there is one case where an animal was actually named after a Pokemon. During the 1850s, a group of paleontologists working in Germany discovered some fossils of young pterosaurs, the dinosaur that Aerodactyl is based on, and were classified as part of the Pterodactylus species. Fast forwarding 150 plus years, however, and we would see this classification change. Back in 2014, a paleontologist named Steve Vidovich posted in an online journal that he disagreed with the previous classification. Thanks to technology, Vidovich was able to show how these fossils had differences to the Pterodactylus species and were a completely new species of pterosaur altogether. After making the discovery, Vidovich reclassified the new species as Aerodactylus, naming it after Aerodactyl thanks to its relationship and similarities with real-life pterosaurs. Next up, did you know that there is a secret, hidden, and invisible PC within Pokemon Red and Blue? Well, believe it or not, there actually is. While in Celadon City, if you head to the hotel that's in town, you can find an invisible PC box in the far right corner of the lobby that's completely functional. The reason why this PC is here is most likely because it seems that the hotel's layout was just a copy and paste of the Pokemon Center's layout, which would mean that the code for accessing the PC on that particular tile was probably just accidentally left in by the developers. You know, Pokemon Red and Blue are probably just as good for their glitches and mistakes as they are for the games themselves. And finally, for the last fact, we actually have a few mini facts about some various Pokemon. First up, despite being pure electric type and being Pokemon synonymous with the various power plants of the games, neither Voltorb or Electrode could learn any electric moves via level up before Generation 3. Secondly, if you take a look at the Pokemon Oddish and Jumpluff, you'll notice that they look almost exactly the same. Their bodies are practically identical, being the same color, the same shape, having the same feet, and having the same color of eyes. Finally, we've got a cool fact about Sawsbuck. You might have heard me ripping on its pre-evolution Deerling a couple weeks ago, but I'm happy to report that Sawsbuck definitely makes up for Deerling when it evolves. The reason for this is because it has a very creative name. The Sauce part of Sawsbuck's name is actually an acronym for the seasons Summer, Autumn, Winter, and Spring, since it is the season Pokemon. Way to go, Sawsbuck, that's some creativity I can definitely get behind. Well, there you go guys, those were 10 Pokemon facts that you probably didn't know until now. Like I said, you guys are awesome, and I know you're all as sharp as a tack, so if you did happen to know any of these, let me know in the comments below, and also be sure to leave a comment if you know of a little known Pokemon fact yourself. As always, make sure to give the video a like if you enjoyed it, subscribe if you're new for new content every Tuesday and Saturday, and until the next one, I'll smell you guys later.